Hello everybody. In the last video for this project, we set up the genre, routes, and controller, and they're not really doing anything right now, but we just kind of got the structure in place. Before we can get back to finishing those, we are going to create a genre model class, and then we're going to set up unit tests for it. So hopefully by now we've talked about model objects in class. If we haven't, we need to do that. So remind me and we'll talk about it, but I'm pretty sure we will have talked about that by now. Really important concept in programming. And actually when you learned about unit testing, we used the artist model as our example. So this is going to be super simple, or super similar, I should say. So let's take a look at the databases first. So as you know, we've got two databases that we're working with. The Chinook test one gets blasted and recreated every time we run our unit tests. And that's just so that we have a database that's completely consistent every time we run our tests. And then our dev database is just the Chinook database. Again, they're both the same right now. They should be, unless you've been messing around with them. But I'm going to go ahead and just open up the Chinook database, and let's take a look at the genre table here. So here we go. Let's look at the structure of it. So if I click on the structure tab here, it'll show me what the columns are here. Now this is a very simple table, and that's why I chose it for our first one. It's only got two columns. It's got an ID column, genre ID, and then every genre gets a name. And I want you to notice that the data type of the name column is set to varchar 120 characters. Okay, so we need to keep that in mind when we design our model object here. Okay, so this is about as simple as it gets. It's just an ID and a name. Okay, the other thing that I want to point out to you is that we're going to run into a problem because the model object that we create is going to have the property names may not map exactly to these column names here. For example, in our model object isn't going to have a genre ID property. It's just going to have an ID property. So we have to take into account how do we pull data from the database and populate model objects, but the column names don't exactly equal the property names. So we have to account for that in our code. We won't see that now, but we'll be getting to it soon when we start querying the database and loading up model objects. Let's go back over to VS Code now. And what we're going to do is we're putting everything related to genres in a folder called genres. That's a good way to organize your large projects, kind of by feature. There are other ways to do it, but we are going to go ahead and add a new file to the genres folder. So go ahead and click on the genres folder and choose new file. And we're going to call it genre.model.js. Genre.model.js, just like that. Okay, now our model classes are going to follow a pattern that we saw when we talked about unit testing. We're going to use a class for our model object, and they're going to have a similar interface, which is a simple one. All of our model objects are going to have a constructor function and a validate function. Okay, now there are ways we could organize our code so that we're really enforcing this interface strictly, but we're not going to worry about that now. If you want to talk about that in class, just bring it up and we can talk about ways that you can guarantee that your model objects all have a specific set of methods and work the same way. We're not enforcing it in our code, but we're going to be careful to make sure that our model objects work the same way. So go ahead and in this file, let's declare a class called genre, like that, and then set up the curly braces here. And now we want to be able to export this class. So the first thing I'm going to do is just take care of that so I don't forget that. So we're going to, there's different ways we could do this. I'm going to do it this way. Module.exports equals, and then our class that we want to export, like that. Now, this is one way to do it. I think we can stick with this, but I believe that I might also be able to do it by commenting out that line right there and just putting exports here. Would that work? Let's see if this gives me, okay. Okay, I'm not sure if there's a quicker way to do that. Well, let's just not worry about that right now. But as you know, there are different ways to export modules, different syntaxes for doing it. But this works, so we'll stick with this. Alrighty, I'm going to help you with the constructor. And so the way the constructor works is that it's going to be used to set the properties of our model object. So to add a constructor function to a JavaScript class, we have to add a function called constructor. Okay, and then so here it is, constructor, pair of parentheses, pair of curly braces. And then I'm going to split those curly braces apart, and we'll put some code inside the body of the constructor in just a minute here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pass in an object as a parameter. Okay, so inside of the parentheses there, go ahead and put a pair of curly braces because we're going to destructure this object. Okay, so we expect this object parameter to have an ID property and a name property. So here we're doing destructuring. Okay, and then inside the body of the constructor, we're going to set the properties of this of this object for this class. So to do that, we go this.id equals the ID parameter that we destructured, or the ID property, I guess is what I could say. And then we're going to default that to being 0. And this is how we can do it. So I think you've seen this before. Okay, and so we're just going to, if an ID is not passed in, we're going to set it to 0 by default. Now that's possible, that can happen because sometimes you'll load up a model object and it won't have an ID because it hasn't been sent to the database yet. So that's why we're doing that here. Okay, and to set the name property, we can do it similarly like this. This.name equals the name property from the object that we destructured. And I don't know if the best way to go about this is to just default it to an empty string. Now, a genre without a name would be not valid, but we're going to catch that in our validate method below here. So that should do it for the constructor. Real simple because it's a very simple model object, just an ID and a name. And then we are also going to make sure that all of our model objects have a validate method so that we can validate them and keep our database nice and free from corrupt data. So, okay, so here we're going to add a method called validate. This should all look familiar to you. Okay, and then I'm going to set this up similar to what we did with the artist model when you did your unit testing assignment. I'll declare a variable that is called isValid, like this, and we'll set it equal to true. And then we're also going to create an object for error messages. So, and I can use const for that. So this is going to be error messages. We'll set that equal to an empty object. And then before we get into the rest of the body of this method, I'm just going to hit return a few times and we'll set up the return statement here. So down at the very bottom, we are going to return an array. So this kind of reminds me of some React stuff that you've seen before, functions that return arrays. So here we're going to return an array and we're going to return two things. We're going to return that isValid variable. That's going to be true or false, and that'll tell us true or false whether the model object is valid. And then in case it's not valid, in case that we return false for the first element in this array, somebody might want to know the error messages as to why it's not valid. So here we'll also return the error messages object. Okay, so now in JavaScript, like many other languages, your functions can really only return a single value, like a single number or string or object or array. But one way to get around that is if you want to return multiple things, you just return an array and put those multiple things inside the array. So that's a good little trick. Okay, now let's move into these blank lines right here, and we'll set you up so that you can finish the code here for this. So first you're going to have to validate the ID. So I'm going to go ahead and put a comment there that says validate ID. And then now let's just put a note here that it says it must be a number greater than 0. Okay, and I think that's really, or actually, it's got to be a number that's greater than or equal to 0, or equal to 0. Okay, so we're saying that 0 is valid because we might load up a model object that has not yet been inserted into the database. And so that means it doesn't have an ID, and we'll just default that to being 0. And then we can use that in our code elsewhere to indicate whether we need to do an update or an insert. Okay, so anyways, there's how you want to validate the ID. Okay, so you're going to have to put this code in place here. And I'm going to give you the unit tests. So you're going to do test-driven development here, where you get all the tests, and then you have to write the code that makes them pass. And now I'm just going to give you the instructions for the name. So here I'll put a few blank lines, and then I'll put a comment here where you can add code to validate the name. And now the name is required, so it cannot be empty. Okay. It must be a string, and it must not be greater than 100, and it must be less than or equal to 120 characters. So remember, the database column was varchar 120. Less than or equal to 120 characters in length. Okay, all right, so you guys are going to have to write the code for this model object. So these are the two. You need to validate the ID and validate the name, okay? And now I think you know how this is going to work. Is if you find that something's not valid, you're going to do two things here. You're going to flip this from true to false, so you'd want to change that if you find that something's not valid. And then the other thing is you'd want to load up this object with a property. Either it's going to have either an ID property or a name property, or if both of those are not valid, it's going to have both an ID and a name property in it. But the way this error messages object works is if you find that, say for example, the ID is not a number, then you might want to put an ID property inside of here and set it to a value of some message that says the ID must be a number, okay? And I think you remember how that works from when you worked on the artist model. So we're following the same pattern here. All of our model objects are going to work the same. All right, so I'm going to leave that blank here. And then what I've done is I've created the unit tests for you, so you can get those off of the web page that has this video on it. And let's set that up right now. And to do that, we're going to add a file to the test folder right here. So you can right click on the test folder and choose new file. And then we're going to call this genre.model.test.js. Genre.model.test.js, like that. Okay. And remember that we're using Jest here. That's our framework for unit testing. And it looks for files that have a .test.js extension. Okay, all right, so now I'm going to give you this code so you can grab this off the web page that has the video on it. And let me just paste this in here. So here it is. I'm going to paste it in here. It's a lot of code, and let's just walk through it real quick here. So first of all, we have to import the class that we're testing. So we're importing the genre model right there. And then we want to put everything inside of a describe function call like that. And then, so this message will show up in the output when the tests are run. We'll see that in a minute here. And then inside of there, we want to create another, we want to use the describe function again for each of the things that we're testing inside of our model class. So we're going to test the constructor, and then that's going to have a bunch of tests inside of that call to describe right here. And if I scroll down a little bit here, there's another describe here that where we're going to test the validate method. Okay, so those are the things that we're testing. And then let's just walk through these tests right here. Okay, so here where we're testing the constructor, here's our tests that we're running here. So the first test is saying it should set the instance variables properly. Okay, now I think this is all familiar to you because you did a lot of this in the artist model object that we tested in the unit testing assignment. Okay, but all we're going to do here is we're going to create a simple genre model and then pass in the parameters. And we just want to verify that those parameters are being used to set the properties properly. Okay, so if we pass in this as our object, then we expect that the genre model that gets returned from calling the constructor has its ID property set to 1. And we also expect that it's going to have its name property set to K-pop, just like that. Okay, so those are our tests there for that set. We just want to, and we could, there's probably other ways we could test this, but we'll just leave it at this now. And then we also want to test the default values. So it should have a default of 0. The ID should default to 0 if it's not included in the param. So here we pass in an empty object and we expect that the ID gets set to 0. Okay, so there's that test. And then we want to do the same thing with the name. Is if we don't pass in a name property inside of this object right here, we expect that the name is going to get defaulted to an empty string. Okay, so those are the tests for the constructor. I'm sure we could come up with more tests. But we're not, this isn't a class about unit testing. But anyways, so that's the end of the constructor tests here. Okay, now the validate one. So here, we want to just test to make sure that it returns what it's supposed to if everything's working properly. So here we're creating a model object with valid data. It's got a valid ID and a valid name. Okay, so in that case, we expect that when we call validate right here, we expect it to return an array that has true for the first element, and then this should be an empty object. There should be no error messages inside of that object. Okay, so that's what we're expecting, and so here's where we can check those. So we expect is valid to be true, and we expect the errors variable to be an empty object. Okay, so we just want to make sure that it returns what it's supposed to when everything is valid. Okay, here it should return the proper values if the ID is not valid. Okay, so look at this. We're passing in a string instead of a number here. So that's technically not valid. We want to make sure that we're checking the data types of everything. Believe me, this can cause a problem. I've seen errors before when you're trying to send strings into the database. It can cause some problems. Okay, so we want to make sure that if you pass in a string for the ID, that is valid is going to be false, and you want to make sure that that errors object is going to have an ID property in it. Now, if we wanted to take this further, we could check that this ID is set to like a message that we want it to result in. Like, maybe the error message would be ID cannot be a string or something like that, or the ID must be a number or something like that. We're not going to go that far. We're just going to check to make sure that there's an ID property in our errors object right here. Okay, and then you can just, I think a lot of this we've already talked about, but you should go through this and make sure you understand each of these tests. Unit testing will make you a much better programmer. I promise you, even though it's very tedious, but it will make you a much better programmer. Okay, so you can go ahead and look at the rest of these tests. Your job now is to go ahead and get all these tests to pass. So let's go ahead and save the files that we started here. So I'm going to save the genre model, and I'm going to save the test that we just added, and let's go ahead and run the tests. So here, if I open up the terminal, now we have a script that we can run. It's npm run test, and then Jest will do a few things. So remember, the first thing that Jest is going to do is it's going to recreate the database. So we set that up in the second video, I believe. It's going to wipe out the database and recreate it. Now that slows our tests down a lot. And I noticed that the tests run super slow on this computer. On my laptop, the tests only take a few seconds to run, but on this computer, for some reason, they run super slow. And this computer has a lot more hardware in it, which is surprising to me, so I don't know what's going on there. But anyways, let's go ahead and run the tests here. npm run test, like that. And let's see what we get here. Now I'm expecting these to fail because we haven't put all the code in place right here, but it's chugging along and it's recreating our database. So that's what's taking so long. And I don't know why it takes so long to run on this computer, really, because this computer has a lot more CPU and RAM than my laptop does, but it's also bogged down with some software too. So, so we have to wait. All right. So some tests did not pass here. So here at this point, we had 3 test suites. Now, I think that's basically 3 test files. So we had our little API test, we had our little database test, and now our genre test. So those are the test suites. And then it looks like 2 failed. Now that means that I believe the constructor failed and the valid failed. So let's just see. Now some of these tests might pass, but you can go through this and it'll tell you the details of why the tests are failing. All right, so your job now is to go ahead and write the code to get the tests to pass. Okay. And once you do that, then the next step for us is to go ahead and create the data access class that will take these model objects and do CRUD operations against the database. Okay, so we're building this project in baby steps, and we have to take care of this before we get on to the data access class that we're going to talk about next. All right, so have fun with that. Let me know if you have any questions.